On this episode of Pipeline Things, before we get into it, I want to ask you as an audience, where does the ILI industry's origin story begin for you? Does it begin with the companies that you know today? Whenever you think of ILI origin, do you think of Rosen, Baker, TDW? What if I told you the origin story is actually much deeper than that, right? And if you go back, you've got to go back to some places in Germany and a company known as Preussach and their involvement with Pipetronics to really understand the landscape of the major ILI players that we have today. This episode, we get into that with Michael Beller, and I think you'll really enjoy hearing where the landscape that we know today comes from and what its origin story is. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to this edition of Pipeline Things. I'm your host, Rhett Dotson, my co-host, Christopher De Leon, as we continue in this series, this arc where we have esteemed guests of the pipeline industry, OGs. Really OGs, sages, wise people, digging into the history of our industry, which is really so much fun. Chris, you're a Marvel fan, right?
Fantastic. 1992, baby. Let's go. That's when it started.
1992.
That's when I got involved.
So
I remember.
What's your favorite origin story?
This is hard. So again, I grew up on the comic, like this miniseries, the TV series, and the two that I really
wait, which miniseries? Like X-Men 97 or something?
Yeah, around 97 is fair. So for me, it was like there's a little bit of like the brutality in it, so it sounds bad, but I was like, you feel bad for him. That's how you get emotional. Because like the Wolverine story was kind of hard. It's like they take this guy, they put all this metal in him, and he's suffering, and so I was kind of like, oh, you kind of feel for the guy. You're like, man, I kind of want him to win. I want him to be happy, and he's never happy. So you're just like always yearning for this guy to find happiness. And then it's kind of like the Jean Grey versus Cyclops saga, and like Cyclops is the better guy, but you kind of just want Logan to get a win, and he never does. So yeah,
yeah. So that's fair because I was thinking like Wolverine probably has the most consistent origin story, but so many of them have like varied origin stories, which drives me crazy because I'm like Spider-Man might be the worst, right? I mean, Spider-Man must have like a dozen origin stories. I'm like, God, Batman's another one. How many different origin stories?
One per generation.
It's something like that,
yeah,
right?
It's one per generation.
But then you grew up on like not Val Kilmer Batman. Oh man, the one
I remember Val
that.
Kilmer.
Yeah, but it was the one
Clooney?
before Val Kilmer. No, before Clooney. And the name is slipping my mind where the Joker was Jack Nicholson. Is that who it was? Jack Nichols? Yeah. Anyway.
Oh God.
That was
he came back as Birdman in Spider-Man.
It's the name slipping my mind.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, that's what I knew as the Batman origin story. And then when you changed it, I get frustrated. I feel like sometimes it's like that in the pipeline industry where you've got all these different origin stories.
Oh, I have to jump in there. This is a little bit telling for me. For example, my favorite Batman is based on Frank Miller's The Dark Knight, which is like the modern Batman, the darker, more meaner guy.
Yeah.
I need to check. Maybe I need to talk to somebody about this.
But that was different than definitely from the Joker from the original 80s.
Freeze with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, that was so bad. It was so terrible. So, but today we get some great origin stories. I'm actually really excited about it because I feel like this is one of those things where depending on how you understand terms, depending on maybe where you entered the industry, you have different impressions on what the quote unquote origin story of ILI is.
And who told you, and if you think they were communicating fact or strong opinion, and sometimes depending who you talk to, you don't know the difference.
Is it elaborated fiction? I mean, sometimes do we recreate history in our own mind to make the story more entertaining?
Or maybe they even add their own element to it to like put their staple on it. Like, oh, when I was there was when this happened.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, look, why don't you introduce our guest? Because I know you and him have a relationship before I did. So I want to give you the opportunity to go ahead and introduce our guest, Chris.
Yeah, no worries. So, hey, guys, I present to you guys Michael Beller. I hold him in very high regard. We were thinking about this OG series. Rhett and I, we spent a lot of time thinking about, like, who are these cool people that we want to bring available to you guys. And at the end of this podcast, I always say it, right? I want you guys to feel like you're relatable in some way, so you could walk up to him at a bar and be like, Michael, what's up? I heard you on the podcast. And he's like, I don't know who you are, but let's have a drink. And second is it's hopefully there's a little bit of knowledge transfer and he can tell you a cool story. So Michael, welcome.
Michael, welcome, buddy.
Okay. Well,
So
first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. It certainly is a pleasure, and I'm already enjoying it. So great. You just introduced me, Christopher. So my name is Michael Beller. I live in Germany, so quite far away from Houston. And I live in a suburb of a town or a city called Karlsruhe. So Karlsruhe is a city that most folks in the US probably have never heard of, but here in Germany it's sort of fairly important because we have our Supreme Court here of the Federal Republic of Germany. And there's one very famous person that was born in Karlsruhe and went to the same university as me. And this gentleman has absolutely nothing to do with pipelines. His name is Carl Benz, as in Mercedes-Benz. So the guy who invented the motor car, he was actually born here in Karlsruhe. I come from a family where most of the people worked for Mercedes, and I'm sort of the black sheep in the family because I joined the pipeline industry, but I've always loved it. And again, happy to be here.
yeah, so Michael, the reason we brought you on, I mean, we could have a conversation about Mercedes. That'd be fascinating. But it's definitely your background. So when we thought about history of ILI, Chris is like, I want to talk to Michael. I was like, I actually don't know who Michael is. But in our pre-show stuff, I was like, oh, this is going to be fantastic. So audience, as we're introducing, I want you to think about all the ILI tools that you use today. Yeah. And many of you are probably running inspections with either something that's called high res or ultra high res or micron or any of the names that are currently used, Gen 4, Gen 5. I'm trying to think.
Plus, there's a lot of plus,
ultra, superior. I mean, I feel like they put all these different names. And if you had to just stop before we even get in with Michael, when do you think those technologies came around? I'd ask you, audience, to think about that. When do you, if you had to guess, maybe some of you know, some of you don't. Mm-hmm. When was the first MFL tool, and where did it start? Those are the questions that we want to get into with Michael, which is, what is the origin story of ILI technology, MFL, and caliper as we know it today, right? So hopefully that's the hook that kind of draws you in, because Michael's got a rich history with it. So, Michael, having set the stage for you speaking to all things origin, tell us, so how did you avoid the auto industry and find yourself in the pipeline industry?
And what was the state of the art?
And what was the state of the art of the auto cars or our industry?
Yeah, our industry.
Okay. Well, I wanted to be an engineer, so I studied mechanical engineering at the University of Karlsruhe, actually, although I'm not originally from Karlsruhe. And whilst you're doing that, obviously, you also eventually have to look for a job to earn some money as a student, because, you want to have a good life, and the car has to be paid and all of that. And it so happened that I was at we call them institutes, at one of the institutes at the university, and there was a piece of paper there, and they were looking like for a student assistant. That's what we call it here in Germany. And I picked up this piece of paper, and it just so happened that there was a project that had something to do with pipelines and not motor cars. So that it was a pure coincidence. I then stayed on. I finished my studies in Germany or in Karlsruhe, and then close to Karlsruhe we have something at that time that was called the Nuclear Research Center. It is today part of the university. So the University of Karlsruhe, they're called KIT, Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and they also have this former nuclear research place. And the interesting thing is that this research institution was actually involved with developing an inline inspection tool. Yeah, so it was
the Nuclear Research Institute was.
Sorry?
The Nuclear Research Institute was involved in developing.
Yeah. I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, that was my first sort of attachment to our industry, and I found it so exciting that I decided, okay, forget about the motor cars. Let's do something with pipelines. When I finished my studies, actually, I didn't immediately join industry, but I decided to go for a PhD, which I did at the Nuclear Research Center in conjunction with the university, on the subject of fracture mechanics, and it was fracture mechanics of pipeline steel. So that's the next link to pipelines. And then I started working for a large German corporation, which at that time had a pipeline construction division. They were called Preussag. Now, the interesting thing about Preussag at the time is they were the German representative of an ILI company called Pipetronics, right? But Pipetronics at that time was a subsidiary company of Trans-Canada Pipelines. But they already had an office close to Karlsruhe in a suburb called Stuttensee. And that sort of was the nucleus in this part of Germany, with lots of ILI activities over the years. Now, you did ask also the question about, what was the state of the industry, and where do all these terms and how do they all fit together? So let me at least try and start to answer that question, and remind me if I'm missing something.
Wait, let me set the timeline, because I want to make sure I understand it. You joined this subsidiary of TransCanada, Pipetronics,
No, I
or
joined
Preussag. You joined
Preussag.
Preussag, right? I'm sorry, which was a German rep.
Yeah, and they were the German representative of this company called Pipetronics, which was a subsidiary of TransCanada Pipeline at the time.
This is the
Yes.
TransCanada Pipeline that we know today.
This is the TransCanada Pipeline, which today is called TCE. Yeah.
And this is 1988?
This is 1988.
All right.
joined the industry in 1988. Yeah. And then in
Fantastic.
1991, and I looked this up because I couldn't memorize it. In 1991, this German corporation called Preussag, they actually bought the ILI activities of TransCanada Pipelines, because TransCanada Pipelines decided to do other things or go back to the core business. So that is when Preussag took over Pipetronics, and then basically started to have their own inline inspection company, which they've integrated into their pipeline service division. So that's basically how it all started, or at least where it started for me. Yeah.
All right. So what's the state whenever you got involved in 1991?
Well, I got involved in 1988, because that's when Preussag was already the representative. And the thing is, I mean, the ILI industry was quite different to what it is today. It was a much younger, less mature industry than it is today. Although the history of ILI goes back, far beyond when I started. So first ILI tools were actually developed and introduced into the market in the United States, where you gentlemen are. Companies like TD Williamson or Tuboscope were the first people that were involved with ILI and had developed ILI tools. And then later, of course, more and more use was made with them, because original tools, they didn't have such, let's say, low thresholds of finding defects, and not the accuracies certainly that we see today. And what I remember when I entered the industry is, first of all, that there were different companies about. Some of them are still around today, but others aren't, unfortunately. I'm a very nostalgic person, so I like also the history of companies. And there was a lot of controversy, because there were still people at the time saying, well, this ILI stuff, well, can we really trust it? Wouldn't it be just better to do pressure testing all the time? And, do we really need ILI? Because
things haven't
pipelines
changed very much from a lot of people.
It's like 30 years.
Our
we're
federal
still doing
government
this.
now finally believes that ILI is a little bit better, but it's been a long journey.
I'm not commenting on what's happening on your side of the Atlantic, but I'm reminiscing, and obviously this is all my perception, gentlemen. So there was this controversy also here in Europe. And I also remember in the very early days when I was young and naive, and I'm just naive now, but not young anymore, unfortunately. There were people that told me, well, we will never need ILI tools because pipelines are coated and we have cathodic protection. So what's the point, right? But later, of course, time has proven that using ILI makes sense. But the thing is, this term of resolution could be a little bit misleading. Because resolution is a three-dimensional thing. So in those days, close to 40 years ago, when people talked about resolution, it was just a depth resolution, they were concerned about. And you know as well, you know better than me, you know, when you do the defect assessment and you want the length of a defect and the deepest point and so on, that's basically what they were looking for. And these, let's call them first generation or early generation of tools, had a very limited accuracy and a very limited depth resolution. So then all this wonderful work was done in the United Kingdom. I'm pretty sure you all know that, you know, around British Gas Engineering Research Station and so on. And they basically went the next step to have tools which at that time were actually called high resolution tools. That's where the term comes from. And the story behind that is that a lot of burst tests and things were done. And I'm sure you had other guests in your program that know much more about those programs or those tests, but they did all these tests and they could identify minimum defect specifications that an ILI tool should really have in order to make it useful for a defect assessment, right? And British Gas, at the time, Engineering Research Station, they were sort of the first people to address that. Wonderful work, lots of papers published. And then introduced a new generation of magnetic flux leakage tools, which were termed high resolution tools. And they already had this 10% depth threshold, which actually is still a number around today. Now, of course, people say, yeah, but the technology has improved over time. And yes, of course it has. It's a continuous development. So they're even as we speak, tools are getting better and better and better. But the other two dimension of the resolution, of course, is the circumferential resolution. So in these first sort of tools had quite clumsy sensors. They were quite wide, so you can't place so many around the circumference of your pipe, and therefore your circumference resolution is limited. So you make them smaller and smaller and smaller, and this trend is still there. And the next thing, of course, is the power of the electronics you have. I mean, how much can I record as I go along the pipeline? Because the signals, I mean, the MFL signal is an analog signal, and then you digitize it. Yeah, and that has to do with the power of the electronics. So it might be a bit misleading, but in the true sense of the word, going back in history again, you know, when I entered the industry in the 1980s or late 1980s, 1988, there were already these tools called high resolution tools, but the high resolution was a relative term. It was related to depth resolution, and it was in comparison to the earlier generation. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So I want to ask a couple of questions, Michael. So since you said you're nostalgic, who were the major players in the 1980s when we were talking high resolution tools? If you were an operator and you wanted to run somebody, who were the players back then?
Well, when I entered the industry, Preussag was a, you know, the representative of Pipetronics, but just prior to that, Preussag actually had their own division that were running pipelines. Not many, nothing compared to TransCanada Pipeline and so on, but they also ran pipelines, and they had inline inspection companies, or they had tenders for inline inspection work. And the companies at that time were people like Tuboscope or Vetco. I mean, names
I've heard these names.
well known, but they weren't really that happy. I don't mean not happy with the service, but the results, because the results from these earlier generations, they didn't really help you to fully understand the state of your pipeline. Although these tools were already a milestone in themselves, because when you think about it, they told you something also about subcritical defects, whereas pressure testing will only tell you where the line pops, but doesn't tell you about all the other things. So don't get me wrong, there's no disrespect or anything, but these were the earlier tools which weren't quite as helpful, let me put it that way. So when I entered the industry, obviously Pipetronics was around because I entered the industry when Preussag was involved with them. But I think the number one company, this is my recollection and my perception, but the number one company obviously was British Gas, and they had this inline inspection activity, which they called OLIC at the time, Online Inspection Center. And later they rebranded that into Pipeline Integrity International, PII, which of course is a term which we still use today. But when I entered the industry, so they were definitely the number one. And then there were other companies involved, Tuboscope and so on. And Pipetronics was already around. Now, of course, at that time, I didn't know so much about the industry as I know now, because when you come as a young graduate and you have your first job, you sort of have a very limited view. So when I entered, when I joined Pipetronics, what I found exciting at the time is that all the tools that were used for metal loss inspection were based on magnetic flux leakage technology, which is a absolutely fantastic technology. But it so happened that the company I had the honor and pleasure of being hired by, Pipetronics, had originated from another German company called Kopp. The company Kopp is in Lingen, Emsland, which actually is where Rosen is and where 3P is, and so it's one of the birthplaces of ILI in Germany, definitely. But anyway, this company Kopp was founded by very clever gentlemen who originally came from the pressure testing side of things, and had then already developed also caliper tools. He didn't invent them, but they also had caliper tools in this company called Kopp. And Kopp then decided that they couldn't live forever on just having a caliper tool in their portfolio. So they said, well, what else can we do? And it was quite obvious that metal loss is one of the issues. So having a metal loss inspection tool is something that's worthwhile doing. But there were already all these other competitors with, MFL tools were getting better and better. And it then so happened that this company decided to use another technology. And they said, well, why don't we try ultrasound? Let's do an inline inspection tool with ultrasound. And they started doing this development work, and for all sorts of reasons which have to do with finance and so on, the R&D department of Kopp, which actually started this development, they relocated to where I live, southwest Germany, Karlsruhe, mainly for funding reasons, because there was money available here that wasn't available at other places at the time. And then together with the Nuclear Research Center, Pipetronics developed this first ultrasonic metal loss inspection tool. And with ultrasound, as you know, the added value is you can do this quantitative wall thickness measurement. So you can measure remaining wall, let's say, with a higher precision than with MFL. This is not meant in the sense of good or bad or anything. It's just different. Yeah. Physical principle.
And what's the timeline? I'm sorry, I was fascinated. Normally, you kept going, and I was just like, I just want to listen to the story. Michael, what's the timeline of this ultrasonics development? So MFL is not mature in terms of deployment, but mature in terms of what you guys considered high resolution depth, 10%. And then ultrasonics now emerges as a research initiative / development initiative. What's the time frame on this?
Well, that was sort of middle to late 70s when that started. So this is the development work, and we all know it always takes longer than you think. And then the market introduction was early 80s, 83, 84. So this tool was already there when I arrived on the scene, but of course it was still in a very prototype stage or just about being commercialized. So when I joined Pipetronics, or actually I joined Preussag, but later when Preussag bought Pipetronics, we were all transferred to Pipetronics. That was sort of the very beginning, so to speak. Yeah, it wasn't a prototype anymore. It was already a commercially available tool, but it really was the beginning. And it was, for those days, in true sense, also a high resolution tool. The ultrasonic tool of that time I'm referring to already had a depth threshold 1 millimeter, right? So anything deeper than 1 millimeter could be picked up. And I think even today that is sort of impressive, but of course tools have improved. So, things have happened.
Will you just clarify the relationship between COP and Pipetronics?
Yeah, COP was COP is still around, but they're a subsidiary of Baker today, at least to my knowledge. But this gentleman called COP, it was a family business. They started to develop an ILI tool, and they basically, they had an R&D department, obviously, and they took like the R&D department and made a little company out of it, and that was branded Pipetronics. So that's where the name comes from, and the name came from the gentleman who was running the department. His name is Hartmut Gödege. He's also still around.
So, and then Pipetronics finds its way into PII, which then eventually finds its way into GE, which we know today
as Baker.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, that is also very interesting. You see, when you're younger, you think in companies, right? So when I was like in 20s, 30s, and you went to a conference and you went to an exhibition booth, you were quite awed by the other competitors being there. And, dare I talk to someone from PII, or is it okay to talk to someone from Tuboscope? And you were very much your company. But as you are in the industry for longer and longer, you realize that especially the ILI industry is like it's sort of like a family, right? We're competitors, but somehow we're all in the same game. So we have a beer together and stuff like that.
I think it's more like Game of Thrones, to be honest with you, here in North America, if anybody gets that reference.
So what I found very interesting is, of course, that, and I must admit, when I was at Pipetronics, we sort of did look up to PII, right? So the British Gas thing, they had all this knowledge about pipelines, the integrity side, all of that was very, very impressive. And then the merger occurred. We called it the merger at the time, when PII bought Pipetronics. And I can't quite remember which year that was, around the 2000s. That must have been 2000, 2001, something like that. But what a lot of people don't know anymore, or might have forgotten, is that Pipetronics actually consisted of two parts. There was like a center of excellence regarding ultrasound here in Stuttensee, so Karlsruhe, where I live. And there was the other part of Pipetronics in Toronto, because remember, Pipetronics originally, the family COP sold the business, or had sold the business at one point to TransCanada Pipelines.
Who was in Toronto at that time, but is now stationed in Calgary. This is
exactly.
Great.
So first that company was sold to TCPL, and then TCPL later sold it to Proisac to get the timeline right. So the colleagues, the Canadian colleagues at Pipetronics, they never relocated to Calgary. I mean, TCPL went to Calgary, as we all know, but they stayed in Toronto. And then when Proisac took over, obviously that was Pipetronics offices. And there's a lot of people there, and they were mainly working on the MFL side. So they also developed high-resolution magnetic flux leakage tools, whereas we in Germany were focusing on the ultrasonic tools. And what happened then, just from a historic point of view, I also find quite interesting, because when PII took over Pipetronics, and eventually that ended up in GE, quite a few people left those two companies for all sorts of reasons, right? Maybe you want to do your own thing, or whatever the reason was. And the German side of Pipetronics, people that originally came from Pipetronics, they founded a new ILI company called NDT Systems and Services, which today is called NDT Global. But the Canadians also, they did their own thing. And one of the companies that was founded at the time, although there were other people involved, not just Pipetronics people, was CPIG. Do you remember CPIG? Later Baker.
All right. Michael,
Yeah.
we are going to pause
And Ron
right
Thompson,
here.
of course. I must mention Ron
Yep,
also.
we're about to get into what I call the GE mafia. But audience, we need to take a quick break before we circle back around with Michael and talk about this ultrasonic development and what I term the GE mafia if you've never heard about it. Stay tuned and we'll be right back. All right, audience, as we come back with our guest, Michael Beller, you heard a great overview of some of the origin story of the ILI, but I need to step back as the host and sort it out just a little bit for you, right? Because even myself, I'm having trouble kind of keeping all of this in my head, so to speak, and I'm learning things that even definitely I didn't know, right? So at the time Michael steps into the industry, he's told us that there are these, the major players, Vetco, Tuboscope, British Gas, he himself, TDW. Yes, he himself is a part of this German company or German company Preussach, who's a representative of Pipetronics, who most of us have probably heard about, right? And then we learn that PII, who is the subsidiary of British Gas and Olik, is eventually merged with Pipetronics. So you've got PII and Pipetronics together. All of that is sold to GE. And what we just touched on, and many of you might know, is that's like kind of the birthing place, the spawning ground for many of the major players that we actually know today in the industry. And I wanna give Michael the story. So Michael, did I get that part of the origin story right prior to the early 2000s? All right, so we've got GE Pipetronics together, right? And you mentioned Pipetronics got these two halves, right? It's got the half that's still tied in Toronto, which is funny because that's where TC Energy used to be headquarters. And many of you, like me, are probably appreciating how integral TC Energy was to much of the development of ILI technology. And then we've got this other side, which is in Germany on the ultrasonic side of Pipetronics.
I feel like this is where all the houses, back to the Game of Thrones, I feel like this is where all the houses' names are about to start popping up. It's like the House of X and the House of Y. So here we go. Bring on the houses, Michael.
All right, so the ILI clans, where do they come from?
Yeah, I'll stay with the Canadian side if I may.
Sure.
And what happened in my recollection is that on the Toronto side of Pipetronics, also ILI companies sprung up. So CPIG was one of them, but it wasn't, as I said, just Pipetronics people. There were other people involved. Mark Olson is a very famous name there. All very, very clever people. And then somebody else from Pipetronics who went his own way is Paul Larson. He started an engineering company called Invodane, also in Toronto. And later they founded a company called Pipetel, which started to be active in what we call challenging pipeline inspection today. I'm pretty sure I've forgotten someone now. I know, Ron Thompson. Ron Thompson, very important name in our industry. He also started his own company. I think it was called Intratech, but correct me, Ron, if I'm wrong, if you hear this. but Ron actually, and also the CPIC guys, they sold their companies for reasons I don't know to Baker. Baker at that time had already collected some other companies, and as I talk about it, we should write a book about this because there is another line there, because in Canada, of course, there were also clever people that went into developing inline inspection technologies. And I remember at one of the first conferences that Preussach sent me to, and timid little engineer I was, so I was very impressed by meeting all these famous people. There was a Canadian company that had introduced a mapping tool. And I think it was a research company called Pulse Search, and they had developed this tool together or on behalf of a company called Nausco. And Nausco was taken over by BJ.
Mm-hmm.
But BJ Services, they had their own inline inspection tools, the vector tools, speed control, and all that wonderful stuff. And then BJ was taken over
by Baker.
By Baker. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Weatherford was taken over by Baker.
Which had the Russian tools.
Yeah. and Weatherford actually took over. Oh, it's getting more and more exciting here, because at that time there was also a company in Russia.
Yeah.
Into inline inspection. And this Russian company that had actually developed their tools first using technology they had bought some other place, but they were also very clever people, so they further developed that. And that company was taken over by Weatherford. And then this whole thing, I mean, Baker now with all these ILI companies, and it must have been quite a challenge for the management to integrate everything. So, you know, I admire those guys. And then the whole thing was taken over by GE, and we all know what happened after that, right? So,
because Ron's company also went into Baker, right?
sorry?
Ron's company also went into Baker, so you ended up having Baker.
His first company went into Baker, yeah.
So Baker ended up being like a holding for all of these ILI companies.
Sort of, but then all sorts of things happened, and you would have to ask those gentlemen like Mark Olson or Ron Thompson or Paul Larson what happened after that. Because new companies were formed again. I mean, the CPIC, I mean, you know, Integra.
Yeah.
Integra sort of was started by people that were originally CPIC and then Baker for a while, and then they started CPIC.
Mark Olson again.
Mark Olson, Rick Desonnier again.
Sometimes in history, you go full circles. So I'll share this with you. Remember, Pipetronics, Canadian part, German part, ultrasound, and MFL.
Magnetics.
And on the German side, some people had left for whatever reasons, and they founded this company called NDT Systems and Services, which were heavily into ultrasound. They didn't do any MFL, at least not when they started. But NDT Systems and Services was also sold at one point and bought by somebody, and that person also sold it on and ended up with Privian, Edify. And they eventually, they bought Integra not so long ago. But when you think about it, it's Pipetronics too, because they brought together the Canadian part, or some people of the Canadian part, and of the German part.
I got what you're
It's
saying.
not the same people anymore because a lot
circular.
of people have retired or done other things. But you know, when you think about it, I think it's quite an interesting story.
So it's funny. So you've got Baker gobbling up all these companies. Baker gobbles up and acquires a whole bunch and becomes the Baker GE, and then eventually GE, then eventually Baker. But when we put those two together, becomes the entity that we know it today, which is actually a smorgasbord of many different technologies that were assembled from the fallout of kind of the Pipetronics side, but really driven mostly by the Canadian or North American market, I'm going to say. And we know that after GE, they went on and respawned new companies and have now kind of regathered.
Yeah.
And so I've got the picture of Baker GE on one side. I've got the picture of NDT forming on the other side of the pond, which is in its infancy and only concerned with ultrasonics. But there's one major player we're all familiar with that had its birthplace in Lingen. And so I'm curious if you know the origin story there, because you mentioned Lingen was this.
We haven't heard the big R yet.
Yeah, there's this hot seat in Lingen. There must be a tie there with Rosen. In Lingen, right?
Yeah. So Rosen, and I must say at this point, I mean, I worked for different ILI vendors, which I think was already clear, but I had the honor and privilege to work for Rosen for the last third of my career. And I must say that Herman Rosen definitely is one of my really big heroes in the pipeline industry. And I don't know all the little secrets, so you would have to talk to Herman himself.
Maybe you can help us get Herman on the podcast.
Yeah, we don't need to start with the garage story or the climbing out of the window story that most of us that work there are familiar with.
So the company was founded in 1981. So this is slightly behind the Tuboscopes and the Vetcos of this world. And the truth is that Herman started in an office above a garage. So Steve Jobs started in the garage. Herman started on top of the garage, so we'll leave it hanging there. And then he's a electrical engineer, and I think he even started in that business. So he was doing electric engineering thingies, but then he discovered our industry. And I think the first tool in my recollection, I mean, I wasn't at Rosen at the time, but I think the first tool he developed with his team was a caliper tool. And then following on from that, he went into MFL technology. And then, this wonderful story of Rosen. And today, I mean, I told you what the companies were at the time, but today, of course, we all know Rosen is definitely the number one company, Rosen Group, in our industry, inline inspection and integrity assessment. So it was Herman, entrepreneur, very clever technical person, excellent.
So, Michael, I have to jump in because I'd love for somebody to correct us. Obviously, when I got indoctrinated and at the time into Rosen, when I got hired on by Mr. Yoxel, I was like, man, give me the origin story. And so we hear the garage story, we hear all that. But the other one that I heard was I had to assume it was with COP. Apparently, Herman was driving and he saw some lads on the side of the road doing something. So he pulls over and he's like, what are you doing? And they were like, oh, we're inspecting a pipeline. He's like, with what? And that's the first time he got exposed to a caliper pig. And so he was like, ooh, I can do this as an electronics engineer. And then he goes back to his garage and voila, what we now know as Rosen is born. And I just thought, man, how cool is that? Because back to the whole full circle, if that's true, it's just that whole idea of like
it's very interesting you sharing this. I can well believe it. I wasn't at Rosen at the time, and I haven't been at Rosen as long as Chris, so I'll have to tell Chris, why didn't you tell me that story? It's embarrassing that I don't know that story. But it all started in Lingen, and there was also some connection or some relationship between Herman Rosen and the Kopp family. I don't know any details. You would have to ask him. So there are good reasons why Lingen. I mean, Lingen really is the center of anything to do with pigging in Germany. Now my friends here in Studensee wouldn't like that. So, but don't tell them. But Studensee, of course, because of the development of the ultrasonic tool, became like sort of the second center within Germany. But Lingen and Studensee, those are the two places. And coming back to Studensee, what I find amazing is that sometimes, when I wasn't retired, so when I was still traveling a lot, people didn't know Karlsruhe, Karl Benz and all that. They didn't even know which part of Germany I come from, but they all heard the name Studensee. Oh, Studensee, that's where those ILI tools come from. And Lingen, of course, the same thing. So lots of people in our industry know Lingen. But Herman, of course, is a very, very important part of our industry, but sort of started, it was another nucleus, know what I mean? So there was this TCPL side of things, British Gas side of things. And then, of course, the Tuboscope and TDW were at the origin. I mean, TDW were the folks that came up with the first caliper tool. To my knowledge, that was actually T.D. Williamson. And then Tuboscope were the first MFL tool. Yeah.
So I want to lay the landscape for most of our modern industry audience. Just think about me. When you think about the major players in the industry, I think Rosen,
T.D. Williamson,
TDW,
and NDT Global.
NDT. No, I wasn't done. Rosen, NDT, TDW, Baker, Integra, Novatech. So many of those, right? Like, so Rosen, we theorize, has some connection to COP, and that, not a direct connection, but an association by geography.
They knew each other. I'm not saying there is a connection with these two companies.
But then these other ones, think about it. Like, so Baker GE gobbles up all of these companies that come out of the PII, Pipetronics merger, right? And then those people kind of go off and do their own thing, right? So you get NDT forming over here on the ultrasonic side, Integra forming up on the MFL side. They eventually come back under one umbrella together. You've got another individual who starts his company, Ron Thompson, Novatech, who's back on the MFL scene, right? And is a player today. But it's funny to think, that the industry, while it gets gobbled up and got condensed, is kind of circular, as you pointed out, right? Like, so GE gobbled them all up, and then they spawned new ones, and now they're being gobbled up again over here.
As I said, it's a small industry. It's sort of a bit like a family, and me and others always say you have to be friendly to each other because you meet everybody at least twice.
Yeah. And again, just a little bit of a kind of like a footnote, right? So I mean, there are so many more ally companies out there, right?
This is true,
and we're not trying to cover everybody, right?
Yes.
The idea here is a little bit of a disclaimer. Is like this is Michael's story, right? This is his experience. I mean, there's still companies like Enduro, right? that
true.
here in the US and other companies that we didn't, I mentioned Quest, and how
Stream,
Quest was
Quest,
also
yeah.
then, you know, merged into, bought by Baker. You know, we didn't get into the whole like Log, NDT, Tuboscope side. So there's all these other fantastic companies that are doing really cool things. This is, again, the focus here is it's just kind of Michael's story and like his perspective. He said, this is my nostalgia, right? This is what I've seen in his story. So just a little bit of a footnote there for everybody. Let's go on the technology side. All right. So we've talked about the big R. You know, when you came in, you know, you gave us a good idea of like, you know, ultrasonics. And honestly, when I think you did a great job, because when I think of ultrasonics and NDT systems, I think, you know, metal loss, but then there's another big component of cracks. What's your nostalgia and storytelling about cracks?
Well, the crack story actually started in the 70s when a very little German company called Gödecke was actually the dad of the gentleman I mentioned before. He developed a eddy current crack inspection tool. Now, the issue with eddy current is you can only measure things on the near side, so this tool was only good for internal cracks rather than the whole picture, and wasn't commercially such a big story. But that was basically the first crack inspection tool in the history of ILI. And then it went on that companies, Pytronics, for instance, developed the first ultrasonic piezoelectric crack inspection tool, which was commercialized in the 1994, 1995, so some 10 years after the.
And at that point, you were at NDT Systems, right? Systems and Services at this point?
No. Pytronics were the first people to come up with a slanted beam crack inspection tool using piezoelectric sensors, because NDT only happened after the turn of the century.
Yeah, but those were in the 90s. I'm just trying to check here a little, right? But the Pytronics side, that was in the 90s though, 80s, 90s, when they were doing the slanted beam UT. I'm talking when NDT brought it around. That's at that point you were with NDT Systems for the development of their crack technology.
When the NDT started, they started with a white sheet of paper, so to speak, because they came from Pytronics, and they also developed wall thickness measurement tools, but also crack inspection tools. That's correct. But at Pytronics, they were the first guys to have that. So the first technology that you could call a high-resolution crack inspection technology was piezoelectric ultrasonic tools, which of course need a liquid couplant, so they're not really ideal for gas pipelines where the cracks are more dangerous. And then the next step was the development of the EMAT tools. And EMAT, of course, is also ultrasound, but people call it something different. It's just the mode of how you create the ultrasound is different. It's an electromagnetic principle to create the ultrasound, but the tool itself is an ultrasonic tool. And that development started in two companies. So actually, Pytronics also was working on that prior to being taken over by PII. At the very same time, there were all these wonderful developments at Rosen, ending with the Rosen EMAT tool, and names that have to be mentioned are, of course, Herman, because he had the vision to have such a tool. But I would like to mention George and Ron Ahlers, who in San Luis Obispo were very important people driving this technology. So that's the EMAT technology, and then later. We find that even more refinements were possible. So today there are also phased array tools looking for cracks and stuff like that. And it was actually PII that introduced the first phased array tool that could do cracks and wall thickness at the same time with something called a linear phased array. This is roundabout a bit after turn of the century. And because we're more interested in the history and people, rather than the technology, there's another name I would like to mention, Wolfgang Krieg, right? You met him when he was with Rosen, but he was also with other companies. Wolfgang was my boss several times when we met over and over again, and I have very fond memories of him. And it gets even more interesting because it's Wolfgang's brother, Professor Gunter Krieg, who was sort of one of the most important people in getting this first ultrasonic tool actually being developed. So the Krieg family also plays a very important part in our industry.
Fascinating. I feel like we could, Chris, I really feel like we could keep going.
I have one regret. We're not actually doing this over a beer. That would have been fantastic. I could totally go for a Dunkel or a Hefeweizen.
Yeah. So it's so interesting when you hear how many of the people within the industry and if there's one thing, audience, that I hope you take away from this, you've actually said it several times, Michael. And I say it, but probably not from the amount of background and history you do, which is, you should assume that whoever you're working for or working with, you will see in some capacity again in the industry, either as a client, as a boss, or as a colleague. And it really speaks to how well you need to treat each other and how small the integrity industry is in our place. Because again, like, you might be working for someone today, and then you might be working with them, or they might be working for you later on, right? Like that, I don't think that's going to change.
I'll say it a different way. I would say, I think we're all blessed to be in a really cool industry.
Yeah, we are.
It's small, but it's big, but we all kind of know each other. We're all mission oriented for, public and pipeline safety. And we all know the importance of the energy infrastructure, and we play a super cool part in that. And I love that you were willing to come on and give your perspective and your nostalgia. Without, guys like you guys coming on and sharing some of these untold stories or things that people couldn't find in a book somewhere, this would be a lot less fun. So that's just my way of saying, I hope you guys enjoyed it.
I just want to say I'm really grateful that I had the privilege of being in this industry, like 38 years. I've retired now, but I'm still keeping myself busy, but mainly on the lecturing side and writing articles and being involved with some conferences. And I think we have an industry full of clever, talented people, but also very nice people like yourself. So I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Well, thank you. And again, about that book, man, you should talk to Jerry Rao. Maybe we can have a third book, and we like in the beginning.
Nothing against Jerry, but I don't know. Maybe we should rethink, the whole, the origins of. And we could totally geek out on this. We might have to figure out how to do this. If you know of a good publisher, let us know, Michael. I know that was one of our offline discussions.
Well, fantastic. Well, Michael, again, really, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on. To our audience, thank you for listening to the origin story of ILI Technologies and the players, many of the major players we know today. We hope you'll stick around as we continue our conversations with esteemed guests in the industry. Thanks, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. This episode of Pipeline Things was executive produced by Kara Turner and filmed by Miss Haley Smith. Thank you to FORME Marketing for allowing us to use their facilities, and especially to our guest, Michael Beller, for joining us on this episode.